We'll get more on India, China. So, this is going to be focused specifically on the nature of the India-China interface, and this is more not so much oriented towards the kind of courses you may be thinking about. What I was trying to do in my first talk was to make you aware of the landscape, as it were, and the enormous responsibility that you do face when you're thinking about starting something in China, and the need to observe certain kind of precautions. So that was my aim. This is a more conventional talk on India-China relations, and I will try and cover the diplomatic, political, economic aspects that characterize this relationship. I have an article which chapter is this Oxford Handbook on Indian Foreign Policy that had appeared early last year, and so I written a chapter on China as this, and again it sort of takes the whole 60 years into perspective, try and see what really has been the objectives of Indian foreign policy vis-a-vis China since the PRC and the ROI started to engage. Okay, now caveat here is, of course, that this is going to be the perspective of the state engagement. And that's largely because I believe that our problem when we look at India-China relations, and in my favorite visual, if I were to draw India-China relations as a visual, it would be like an inverted pyramid. So you have the largest set of engagements and interactions happening at the top, which is the base in the top, which is that of officials, leaders, bureaucracies of different kinds, and politicians to some extent, but it's essentially official engagement, and that's really the broadest segment. So you start to come down that triangle a bit, and then you come to the entrepreneurs, the business communities, the people who are engaged in traveling to and fro outside the state designated channels, who are going as individual traders and trading with China, and that number is surprisingly beginning to. So this is part of that kind of dynamism which we talk about in a while. A little lower down, and then you come to the level of students, and so today there are about something like 15,000 students, Indian students in China. The bulk of them are studying medicine. The rest of them now are. This is slowly now beginning to increase. So there are students, there are experts of other kinds, there are technical kind of specialists and so on. So though that's also that's towards really the point. And the point of that inverted triangle, on which this whole thing, the India-China thing rests, is people. That's really the minuscule, and that's the unfortunate part, that any substantive relationship should really be the other way around, that it should be based on this very, very strong people-to-people contacts, which gives the a very intensive, ramified architecture of engagement at the level of the people. That's completely missing from the India-China. So what we really need to do is reverse this pyramid. Unfortunately, at this point, it's likely to stay as it is. Surprisingly, it's managed to, despite the fact that it's resting on this point, it's managed to stick like an inverted pyramid, but that's how it. So when we try to look at this relationship, it is essentially from the point of view of that largest segment of engagement and interaction, that segment which is determining and shaping policy, that segment which is also in many ways affecting the way in which perceptions are being molded at the larger society. It is the engagement of the leaders, their statements, their formulations, their reactions, which then get translated in media in various ways, and that then translates into perceptions. The perceptions that are actually affected by systematic study or objective analysis is quite limited. And it's further complicated by the fact that access to sources of independent information, while there are many, but not easily accessible at the level of ordinary people. Now, interesting thing is that those who are now going and engaging with the Chinese a lot in the trading community, it's quite surprising. If you go to Guangzhou on any given day, you will see that the airport there is full of Indians, traders from northern parts of India, from Delhi and Ludhiana and Chandigarh. These are the places. These are ordinary traders. I mean, they're born there in their pajamas and chappals, and they manage to overcome the language barrier. There are intermediaries who take them to the contacts. Deals are struck. Very often the deals are struck in some very, very basic ways. They come back. And then the orders are sent to whichever manufacturing hub they are going to be coming from. They are shipped and they come to India. So this is happening, and therefore they have access to getting in the right kind of contacts for pushing their trade empires. And partly one of the reasons why you see this flooding of Indian goods is because these traders are, so these are not coming as part of the official trade between India and China. It's largely unofficial. Okay, so that's one part of the story, but essentially trying to say that there is now an energy and a dynamism within this country about the kind of opportunities that China offers. And some of these people who are young businessmen whom one meets, so invariably you're going to China, you're sitting next to another businessman who's going there in some connection with some business or the other. And they are completely frustrated by the fact that they have no access to information, that they have to depend upon their Chinese counterparts to give them information about Chinese markets. They have a major issue about non-availability of Mandarin speakers in this country, so they said we've set up this great facility and we've ordered the equipment, and it's come and it's sitting there for 2 months because I can't find anybody who can read the instructions and help us to assemble it. So they are calling somebody from China to come. And so I was given this SOS that just give me one interpreter for one day when that man comes and he will help us assemble the equipment. So this is something, the Delhi-based businessman who had opened up something near place near Delhi.
Noida.
No, not in Gurgaon, a bit distant. It's a religious place, Haridwar. So actually near, a little distance from Haridwar, there is a huge new area which has been designated for businesses. They're shifting businesses out of Delhi. So a lot of them are being located there. And so they wanted somebody who would, they said we pay for their passage, their food, and they give them a daily allowance, whatever they charge for their thing, please give us. Now, this is just illustrative of the kind of obstacles that are continuing to plague this great upsurge of interest, commercial interest in China. And were the state to step in and actually facilitate the removal of some of these barriers, you could see that this potential could really exponentially increase. So the perspective that I'm going to give you is therefore going to be one in which we are looking at the state and how it has dealt with and engaged with China since. So we quickly gloss over the early period because really that is a story that is known to everybody here. Dawn of independence, liberation, this great optimism regarding the Asian resurgence, and both Nehru and Zhou in the forefront of talking about Asia needing to find its own voice, and that they did not want to be part of this great Cold War. They wanted Asia to develop, and such kind of sentiments were expressed, and the Bandung Conference, and finally, before that, of course, sorry, not Bandung, the Panchashila. So the Panchashila is really the first major landmark between India and China, which can be seen as one of the first joint efforts by India and China to contribute normatively to the international relations discourse. That Panchashila, with its stress on non-interference and no military alliances and respecting territorial integrity and sovereignty and cooperation and so on, essentially was an attempt by these two countries which felt that power politics was essentially reducing the opportunities for Asian countries to develop and modernize and come out of that whole colonial exploitative weakness. So 54 is the signing of the Panchashila, and from a distance it seemed as if this was the height of the major achievement of that India-China bohemi that is seen in the early 50s. And yet today, if you look at the literature, you will see that there is a lot of questioning that even then, now records which are coming out of the intelligence agencies, for instance, or even some books which were published in the early 70s by the Intelligence Bureau, people who were manning the Intelligence Bureau and so on at that time, between Panchashila signing and 59 is when all this bonhomie starts to unravel. With the signing of Panchashila itself, there was a huge debate within the Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Home Ministry and certain intelligence agencies that this essentially was a sellout by India. That Nehru had actually given up all its rights and all its legitimate concerns in Tibet. Now just one more step behind, which is 1950, when the Chinese first marched into Tibet. And that's the time when the first big debate has happened between Nehru and Patel. And everybody is aware of this, that Patel writes this letter to Nehru in which he says, look, this is not good at all, that the Chinese have demonstrated that they have claws, and he described it as an instance of Chinese perfidy, and that today they marched into Tibet and tomorrow they will march here, and this should not be accepted. So this has gone down in the canons as, look, when 62 happened, that look, Patel had warned there. The difficulty with that today, when you're sort of using that as saying that, well, India did not really factor in the possibilities of China's aggressive outreach and quote-unquote expansionism. So today when that argument is made, the difficulty is that when you go back to 1950 and look very realistically at the kind of options that were there before Nehru, they were none. In 1950, India had just started to talk about what kind of a developmental strategy they would adopt. The reorganization of states was still taking place. Accession by certain princely states had still not, still in the process of finalizing. So India's own political reorganization was still in a flux. Realistically, there was no external policy that Nehru could have adopted which could have prevented this. Assuming that India would want to check the Chinese approach, what could be happening? No country at that point of time opposed this. People did oppose the fact that the communists, there's some hue and cry. Britain said some statement, the United States made some statement, but it was essentially not questioning the right of the Chinese to move into Tibet, but rather the fact that the communists had sent their armies there. And nobody really was saying that they would intervene in the matter. So, and the Soviets at that point of time was still about big brother, younger brother kind of a thing with the Chinese. So, realistically speaking, Nehru had no option other than to make another statement about how he hoped that the problem would be resolved peacefully, but to recognize it. Of course, by then, India had already recognized the PRC. And this is the background in which the criticism of Panchsheel was made, that not only did we not say anything or do anything at the time the Chinese sent their forces, but that by signing Panchsheel, we signed away every possible right. And if you look at the Panchsheel, it's actually, Panchsheel is used to describe the agreement that we signed in 1954. The full thing is agreement on trade and commerce intercourse between India and China in Tibet. So it's essentially to do with that, and therefore we had a post office there, we had a customs office, we had some other kind of institutions, and we literally gave them up. So this essentially became, right from the first few years, this problem of how Tibet was being perceived by India and China becomes a problem. And so Tibet becomes one of the most complicated issues that become intertwined with the boundary problem of the world. And remember, 49-50, India-China relations are just about getting, and Nehru made some statements on Tibet in early 1950, and that brought the Chinese absolutely lashing out. So two very hard-hitting articles that appeared in the London Report that in 1950, one in February and one in March, where Nehru was described as the running dog of imperialism, and that actually India was actively working with the imperial powers to undermine China's legitimate concerns in Tibet, that they were working essentially for the colonial powers. So this is in early 1950. And June 1950 is when the Korean War happens, and India plays a very positive mediation role, and there's a transformation. That the Chinese start to look at India. Now when I'm saying China, India, please translate it as the leadership at that point of time. Looking at. So this is the first decade when 1950, they march in, we are condemned, we start to become more acceptable with the kind of role that we play in the Korean War. In 1950, 54, Panchsheel, and it gets capped in 1959. I mean, 1959 becomes the turning point, and that's when the whole, in hindsight, we can say that from 59, what we know now, if we had known then, we should have known that 62 was going to happen. So 59, the Dalai Lama runs and comes to India, seeks asylum, and he is granted asylum. That's the year of the first major clash between India and China on the power. And then India's forward policy. So let me now skip over, because this is all now water under the bridge, although those who are going to study it as scholars and go into it in depth way will then find out other things. So between 1950 and 1960, the relationship passed from one of extreme bonhomie and the in-between bhai to, and if you look at the end of roughly 1950 to 54, it's like really you could, if you just look at, and this is something that you can see in the newspapers of the time, if you access the archival records and see some of the photographs. Nehru goes to China, he's accorded a welcome that possibly no other leader was accorded in China ever. 1 million people lining up the roads, and there's a documentary also. Go on to YouTube and see this. It sort of literally, bit tingles you bit, because he's driving in this open car with Zhou Enlai, and from the airport, and it's very different China of course then, and this throng of people, 1 million lining up both sides of the road all the way. And he's standing and he's waving, and Zhou Enlai, they are amicably smiling, but that was the reception that Nehru got. So there was a commitment to taking this relationship between Nehru and Zhou, and they shared a good bond. Okay, so 1960 is when it's clear that the two sides are completely now at odds about the nature of the boundary. Where it ran, what was the dispute all about, and this between 1957 and 60, white papers are exchanged, some 15 white papers, huge, this amount of correspondence between the two governments about the nitty-gritty of where the boundary ran and which document and which map and which proof and so on. So it's all there, and the two sides are exchanging information and correspondence. And then India's forward policy, very briefly. India's perspective was that this is where our boundary is, and therefore there's no fixed, it's not actually demarcated on the ground, so what we will do is demarcate it. And since we are doing this in our own territory, the Chinese should have no objection, and so they move into areas with a view to demarcating the boundary on the ground. Now, in the larger scheme of things, what was happening was that there were these two notional lines. If you go back to Mr. McMahon and what he did, so he drew this line on the map, the coordinates of which were not at all clear. So there is this nearly 27 kilometer long stretch, depth, not lengthwise but breadthwise, which you don't know where the line runs. So we said, no, we go by this map, and we went and we started to do the line, and the Chinese said, but this is our territory, and so they started to push back, and so it was just a matter of time. The interesting thing is that this situation prevails even today. That even today we have a situation where we are not clear as to where exactly the line is on the ground. So we have a notion that the line is here, and the Chinese have a notion that the line is here. For us, that is the boundary, and for them, this is the boundary. So when we go up to where we think our boundary lies, they consider it a transgression, and when they come up to it, they consider it a boundary. For us, it's a transgression. Now, we claim that the Chinese are transgressing it more. Of course, it's a 4,000 plus kilometer long boundary. And it's not that the whole thing is contested. There are certain parts which have been, the most complicated parts are in the eastern sector and the western sector. Acharya on this side and the Arunachal Pradesh on this side. Okay, we can always have a discussion on the boundary of a lunch or something, but fact is that the forward policy was the reason for the Chinese pushing back, and the push turned into a shove, and then the shove turned into a clash of arms. It was a short war, started in October, ended barely 15 days later. The Chinese withdrew back to the positions they were on before they went in. And that, of course, set off a different era of this relationship. The war destroyed Nehru in many ways. It created a mindset among the Congress party in particular that there was, that Nehru had been betrayed by his friendship for China. And in many ways the Congress party, although it was in power right up to the middle of the 1990s, was unable to, apart from Rajiv Gandhi's major initiative, was unable to make any serious inroads into this rather problematic tangle. Right. Now, the perspective that I'm offering is this, therefore, that from the early 50s, the end of the bye-bye phase, to the emergence of the boundary as a major issue between the two countries, leading to a clash, to the mid-80s. Essentially, the relationship is characterized by the predominance of the boundary as the major factor between the two countries. The need for the two countries to have a settled border actually overshadows all other initiatives or interactions. So not to say that there weren't any, that there were engagements happening, trade had begun. Actually, you know that the Chinese were sending food, grains to India in 1952, 53. So there's a lot of criticism about that also, but anyway. So the first 2.5 decades of India-China interaction is dominated after that initial euphoria about the Asian resurgence actually falls flat. And let us be clear that the Asian resurgence doesn't fall flat because India and China fall out. It was also that the role of Japan particularly and the fallout of Japanese imperialism across Asia had also put an end to that pan-Asian kind of a thing. And then, of course, the India-China fallout. So there were various, and then don't forget that the Cold War was affecting Asia in different ways. So there were those who were with the Soviet Union, and there were those who were obviously on the side of the Americans, and so that had created its own contradictions across Asia, starting from West Asia here to Southeast Asia. So India was, of course, right in the middle of it, but we chose to be non-aligned. Now, the late 80s is actually characterized by a shift in the way in which the international relations have started to operate. The Soviets, post-Afghanistan, were in a bit of a mess. India and China had, in 1984, once again come on the border in a major way. The whole Operation Sundaram II episode in 1984, which actually was after Doklam. I mean, Doklam in fact is the second longest standoff. Before that, in Sundaram II, the Chinese and Indian forces were facing each other for nearly a year and a half. Fortunately, it like this time also, it didn't end in arms, but it brought the armies were actually stationed. This time, of course, we were in Bhutan, but this time, Sundaram II in 84, we were actually positioned in our own territories with tanks and all other gear lined up. So 84 is really when Rajiv Gandhi, who has come to got the mandate to form the government, is one of those men who wants to transform India, bring new technology, introduce IT, and so he's really wanting to get out of that whole straitjacket, if you will, of rivalry with China. And there was enormous amount of resentment within the Congress party, and some people actually actively worked to sabotage his trip, that Rajiv Gandhi was going for shaking hands with Deng Xiaoping. And there was criticism within the party that he was actually betraying Nehru by, and that to his grandson. Some of the senior leaders were very agitated that his grandson is actually. So the fact is that Rajiv Gandhi goes, okay, that begins the next phase, which lasts roughly up to the end of the century. Now, the point about this is that both India and China are readjusting their perspectives towards each other after the late 1980s. If you look at the early 90s, the Chinese are also trying to sort out their peripheral strategy. They're trying to take a more even-handed approach towards the India-Pakistan equation. Chiang Kai-shek goes in 96, November, December to Pakistan and says, you sort out your problems with India, please. Keep Kashmir on the back burner. Don't let it affect the relationship between you two. Improve your relations. Look at us. And he pointed to India, China, saying, look at us. See, we have set aside our differences and we have managed to improve the relationship. So that was the late 90s, and I think from that time onwards, you see the Sino-Indian relationship start. Now, I'm simplifying the story for the simple reason that there is a dynamic that is operating at the level of the international sphere. There is a certain kind of dynamic happening at the regional level. See, the 90s is when the regional trends start to strengthen. The Chinese are actively looking at Southeast Asia as the area where they want to entrench themselves. They have started to receive foreign investment on a scale that dwarfed everybody else's, focused on reforms, looking at India as a possible partner. So the 90s is all about the way in which both India and China are trying to now engage with a globalized economy. So India therefore starts its reforms in 1991. But at that point of time, if you look till about 1993, the Sino-Indian equation was essentially stuck because of the boundary dispute. That despite all these opportunities that the globalized economy, regional dynamics, changing domestic equations offered, the two countries were not able to actually move beyond that boundary dispute. And that was largely because of the fact that the position that India took was that they would not, and this is why probably it relates to the question that you said, why are we paranoid about the Chinese? Because a lot of scholars have taken the view that it's because India refused to actually negotiate a settlement. Because, well, this territory is ours and you have to give it back. And though Deng Xiaoping offered a brilliant deal when Rajiv Gandhi went, he said, listen, let's do the swap. You keep what's yours in the eastern sector, we keep what we have in the western sector, and we done with it. Of course, he didn't offer it to Rajiv Gandhi directly, but he gave an interview just before Rajiv Gandhi reaches Beijing for that 3-minute long shake hand. He's given this interview and he says, this is the best thing. But India was not ready for that. Today, Indians would give an arm and a leg for this. They would, anything to have a settlement on the status quo. And now the Chinese are not wanting to do it. And they will not do anything till the Dalai Lama is around. So their concerns about Tibet and all. So anyway, till the late 1980s and well up to 1993, we have a situation where the boundary is actually the core. It's the number one issue that is creating the problems and therefore limiting the opportunities. But at the same time, we see an interesting rise in bilateral trade that happens over the 90s. It's slow. It's not nowhere as rapid as what happens after 2000. It's slow, but it happens. Now, this is the second potentially, I think, interesting question that needs to be explored. the fact that trade is steadily rising, and not, appreciably impressive rising, starts to change political mindsets? Or is it the fact that 93 is the first major agreement between the two countries on confidence building measures that is signed? 97, yet another agreement, which is maintenance of peace and tranquility on the border. And 2003 is the real landmark agreement, which is that there will be special political representatives to address the boundary dispute and reach a political settlement. So between 93, 97 and 2003, I'm cutting a long story short, is when politics and economics is interfacing in very interesting ways and affecting both positively. The politics got a momentum from the fact that there were these enormous opportunities for increasing trade and investment, and economics in turn is getting a fillip because the political processes are imparting greater degree of predictability into the relationship. And therefore, when 2003, these political representatives, actually you can see that the relationship has moved one circle. That from the point where they said that this is our territory and not negotiable, to the phase which is inaugurated by Rajiv Gandhi, which says that let there be special joint working groups. So what they did was they set up these special working groups which were comprising of officials and cartographers and legal experts and scholars. So broadening, it's not just about my map and your map, but actually trying to place it within a larger context and then see how to address the boundary question. So the joint working group, but it was still a cartographic legal approach to 2003 when the political approach kicks in. The realization that that logic could not resolve the boundary issue, that it had to be a political resolution. And 2003 onwards, you see that there is this even more marked leap in the economic relationship. So roughly around less than $1 billion in trade at somewhere around 97, 98 to 70 billion by the end of 2014. No, 2013. Because by then the problems had begun in terms of the unequal, that China was exporting war and the deficit was going against us. Okay. And finally we come to the present day when the two countries, we can say that if we look at the problems between the two countries, there is a certain kind of a shift in the way in which we will accord significance to the problems. So if till the late 80s and early 90s, the boundary was the most important problem, followed by China-Pakistan relations. And when I say the boundary, it obviously includes the Tibetan dimension, followed by Pakistan. And the third is that what other bilateral kind of issues were. Notably, by the turn of the century, the rivers had started to become, water sharing had started to become. Now, today the discourse is so, till the turn of the century, we can say that the India-China equation had turned one complete circle, that from the heights of that very idealistic vision of what India and China would do, to a much more sober reassessment of the need for the two countries to engage for mutual benefit as well as for the benefit of the region concerned, to the fact that India-China partnership is actually going to be the linchpin for Asian resurgence or Asian prosperity. However, that's when the problems start to happen. And those problems are essentially to do with the fact, so this is the point which we reach somewhere in the first decade of the 21st century. And thereafter, we begin to see the unraveling of a very different set of problems, which start with the rapid rise of China in the global pecking order. Now, between 2003 and 2008, 9, thereabouts, China has moved from being the 7th or the 8th in the global economy to number 3. Today, it has surpassed the United States in terms of gross output. So it is the largest economy in the world, although it is not at all favorably positioned as far as per capita GDP is concerned. And therefore, China keeps saying that we are still a developing country because per capita GDP is nowhere near the developed countries. So this rise of China really, and the relative falling back of India, falling back I say purely in the sense of the divide between India and China, starts to complicate matters. And China's rise is accompanied by a very different way in which it has started to deal with its environment. Whether in Southeast Asia, and we're talking about the India-China, whether in Southeast Asia, or South Asia itself, or West Asia, and then the post-Soviet order, of course, the Central Asian countries, this entire swath, you could see that the Chinese were becoming a far more significant player than that India was. In Southeast Asia, China was at the center of a highly dynamic regional grouping that was coming up. China was a very good trading partner for most of the Southeast Asian countries. In South Asia, China had started to make inroads into all our neighbors. They were the largest trading partners for practically all our neighbors, and there was this Central Asia where the Chinese had begun to launch these huge initiatives for pipelines and so on. So this entire, for India, China's role in all around itself was becoming a big issue. And that's when the whole discourse of the rise of China, then the China threat, then of course the fact that the boundary problem continued to simmer, China-Pakistan equations, and now of course the new framework of Belt and Road. So essentially, you can look at all these small little issues that characterize the interface between India and China. And the fact remains that the political understanding between the two countries continues to be characterized by a competitive power. The China threat has begun to take root within this country, and it has got exacerbated over the last decade, I would say now. The continuing incursions of the Chinese, the relationship with Pakistan, and then of course things like Doklam and so on. So this whole enhancement of a threat that has begun to characterize the discourse in India, and add to it the famous trust deficit. This is very, in practically every writing on the India-China relationship, you will see this trust deficit. Trust deficit. That these two countries are unable to trust each other. Okay, now a last set of issues that I'm going to bring before you is that, therefore, there are two large kind of arguments that are beginning to be seen in this. One is that given the way in which the two countries are positioned within each other, and given the nature of the outstanding problems and differences, and the fact that there is a trust deficit, is likely to make the countries more move towards competitive power kind of politics. That for fundamental reasons, the Indians would like to ensure that they have some insurance against a China that is becoming more and more and then powerful and much more assertive. That's the other word. Assertive and powerful, not only in its immediate regions, but in India's neighborhood as well. And therefore, India needs to also start to think in terms of having its own alliances or having its own frameworks to hedge against the rise of China. So that's one part of the discourse. And the other part, which is talking about, and so if you follow this thing, you will see that inevitably we are saying that India and China are destined to also reach a point where they might clash. The other is which talks in terms of the imperatives for more cooperative dynamics between India and China. And their argument is that which we say that in every respect, strategically, economically, politically, Indian interests can best be served by having a more cooperative relationship. So let's go to quickly now make, this argument is fairly simple. We know there is inevitable clash. Those who are reading stuff like this in IR discourse particularly will see that for the last 3-4 years we've been hearing so much and reading so much about the Thucydides trap. Okay, that it's part of this whole structural change that we are going to witness in international relations when the existing hegemon, as it were, the United States, is gradually giving way to the new hegemon, which is China. And in this transition, the two countries are bound to clash. A very significant piece of writing has come out of Graham Allison, and it has been equally significantly counteracted against and said there's no such thing. In fact, a very interesting, and I should mail that to you, very interesting review of that book by, again, forgetting the name of the scholar, university, who actually debunks the whole thing. This whole Thucydides trap is a figment of the imagination that actually does not exist. So there is a big debate out there, but the fact that no power transition in the world has come about peacefully. But that's clearly the logic. So by that logic, eventually the Asian order also may see a disruptive transition when China will also seek to completely dominate the Asian scenario. So that is a fairly straightforward kind of a thing to go on to. The more interesting is the set of discourse that talks about the need for cooperation. Are India and China destined to clash? And what are the factors that may work against it? So very quickly we go down to this, and on balance I find that a larger number of books, articles, commentary is talking about a cooperative part. And that's the interesting part, that while the media is full of these very strong condemnation of China, about its intentions, about how it's trying to surround India, its intentions are not very good, they want to grab our territory, that they are nothing short of complete domination, they want us to kowtow, all sorts of very fanciful imageries are being brought up. And the media, mainstream media, is full of very negative assessments about China's intentions and China's role. And yet, the more serious writings, or the books which or the books of the research articles which are trying to examine the future directions of the relationship are talking about cooperative relationship and the factors which will take India and China towards a more cooperative partnership. Okay. And this is to do with the very fact that is seen as an argument in favor of their clash, which is that they are two rising and emerging powers, and that there is a certain kind of emerging that is operating in this emerging and rising, which will need the two countries to come together. And why is that? Okay. The first is historical. First set of arguments which say that unlike the past, when the old order was changed and forcefully and through the use of force, Germany, Japan, Britain, Germany, Japan, that these essentially, and of course the post-Second World War US, that these were essentially transitions which came about as a consequence of the use of large-scale military expeditions. That these were countries which had the capacity and the capability to project force beyond their borders, and not just beyond their borders, but capacity to project force all over the world. And therefore that military capacity gave them the means to be able to bring about a transition in their favor. And that unlike those, China and India certainly do not have the capacity or the capability to project that kind of a military force. Now, of course, we are making this argument in 2017. The Chinese have built one military base in Djibouti, and they've done all this South China Seas, they built up this whole thing. So, of course, it's a highly dynamic process, but at this point of time, both India and China do not have this capacity for military projection. So it's not going to be about transforming a systemic transformation through the use of force. What they are trying to do is a systemic transformation by the very fact of their rise. And that is linked up with the fact that the current system is what has helped China and India to rise. The current global economic system, and even to a certain extent, the political structures, have permitted the integration of India and China into the existing order. Both countries have benefited from it. Both countries are committed to continuing this order. So therefore, while Trump is saying that we'll get out of this and we're going to shut our borders and we're going to move out of this open systems, Xi Jinping is saying China will be at the forefront and vanguard of globalization and will continue to ensure that systems of trade are kept open, that protectionism is not permitted to block our development and so on. So both, and therefore, the two countries have, this is like one of the first set of arguments, that both countries have a stake in the existing order. And having a stake in the existing order means also, therefore, having similar or at least overlapping perspectives on the problems that need to be addressed to enable them to continue to benefit from the existing order. And that's where the constructivist perspective kicks in, that both are committed to working towards a more democratic international order, both economic and political. Both are committed to protecting the interests, their own interests and the interests of the developing countries insofar as climate change is concerned, and a whole set of other non-traditional security threats as far as this international structure is concerned. So both India and China need to coordinate their strategies in their approach to maintaining this current order. Right. The second is related to this, is that they are also keen that the current international economic architecture is more favorable to their growing stature in the world economy. And therefore the kind of initiatives that the Chinese have taken, which have been supported by India, are all geared towards bringing about a better deal for the developing countries. But of course, China and India are in the forefront. And therefore it's quite clear that cooperation between India and China will be quite critical to the way in which these new systems, the bid to bring about reforms in the existing structures will be successful or not. So China and India is now linked to this is the larger question of climate change, and I think here is where the domestic drivers of economic development and the larger question of climate change in both India and China are becoming very serious issues. It's linked up to the question of alternative strategies of development, which are being very seriously discussed in China. In India also, the need to address the problems of climate change. Because it's quite clear that at this rate, so let's look at some of the just a few facts I'm going to give you. If you look at China in 2009, it became the largest consumer of energy, and it's estimated that by 2025, 2030, when China surpasses the United States as the largest, as the number one economy in the world, its oil imports will triple. So already, as a consequence of being the largest oil importer and the kind of strategies that they followed, resulted in significant environmental damage. So you can imagine that their requirements will triple. By the end of the first decade of the century, already they had become the largest consumers of coal, steel, wheat, pork, and the second largest consumer of corn. Okay, so one set of consumption is happening as a consequence of this. Between them, they've got 40% of the world population. Now, India is likely to become by the time China had become the largest importer, India was about 5th or 6th, but now it's the number 4th. So 4th largest consumer of energy, and they are slated to also double their energy by 2025. Okay, so 2 large energy guzzling countries. It's the second largest consumer of wheat, largest consumer of sugar, and one very important item in both the countries is milk. And if you look at the demographic change that is going to happen in India, that by 2035, India will have the best demographic composition, but the young people are going to be the largest segment in this country. Young people being somewhere between the age of 17 to about 35. That's and these are obviously going to be highly aspirational. China is now got into its plateau, but they will have concerns of a different kind, which is related to old age and health issues and so on. Point I'm making that if you look at these kind of statistics between the two countries, they are going to be consuming huge amounts of products and items which require a lot of energy going into their production. This debate about whether the current developmental strategy, which is highly energy intensive, high consumption, and a host of other things, are actually going to be able to help the two countries to deal with this growing demand. Whether the world will be able to meet this growing demand are questions. And particularly if you look at wheat and corn, already between them, India and China, they are cornering 2/3 of the products. So the larger point I'm making is that there is a question of the nature of the strategy that needs to be addressed in both the countries, because it's related to climate change, and that in turn is related to the possibility that the two countries are likely to be able to continue to grow and develop to become the developed country status. So if current strategies are followed, now a very recent book that has come up by a very, very well-known scholar in India, China scholar, political scientist, you may have heard the name, Manoranjan Mohanty. Okay, so he's just come out with this book. It's titled China's Transformation, and the subtitle is a rather intriguing one. It says The Success Story and the Success Trap. And he essentially has made an argument that the kind of problems that the Chinese are now faced with as a consequence of that rapid development of 3 decades plus has led them into a fair amount of mess. The high degree of inequality that characterizes the Chinese society today, the urban-rural divide, the other microeconomic instabilities, old age and health and education related issues, the kind of dissatisfaction that is happening at the level of those who are being left behind, these are becoming serious concerns. Add to the fact that this is unsustainable. And China has already started to face the problem of slowing down growth. In India, we have challenges of a different kind, and a very, very serious challenge. So the point I'm making, and this is really potentially going to be one huge area for India and China to come together, is that we need to be able to now seriously reconsider alternative strategies of development. We need to be able to learn from each other and be able to communicate the right kind of lessons. Otherwise, the success story is going to, we really can't do what the Chinese did. It's not just that it has bad consequences, but it's not possible. So these issues are going to figure more and more. And if you look at the India-China economic dialogue, India-China strategic dialogue, and at the political level, all 3 dialogues have an interesting reference to the climate change problem and what they need to do. It's becoming a very significant part of the bilateral discussions. Okay, finally we look at security. So economy, climate change and security. And these are the 3 broad swaths where you can see trends which are now bringing the 2 countries together. And I've identified these also from the point of view of interesting areas to investigate. Now, security is a bit of a, you would say on the face of it, an issue which is likely to take them apart, not likely to bring them together, because they don't trust each other. It's not just that we don't trust the Chinese, okay? The Chinese are highly distrustful of us because of Tibet. We talk to some of the Chinese scholars and they say that we really think that you are trying to split up China, that you're using the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan population in India and the government in exile in India, and you are actually trying to split China. And it's a serious argument. It's not a facetious argument. There's a deep suspicion that India was never reconciled to Tibet becoming a part of China. So there are these problems. So from the point of view of security. Now, if you look at the current Asian architecture, you will see that there is as yet no Asia-wide regional security architecture in place. The Chinese have begun the discourse, and you can see whether it's at ASEAN +1 or it's the other multilateral fora, they're starting the discourse on how do we conceptualize a common security. So that discussion has begun. But there is as yet no Asia-wide security system in place. And what you have are different strategies adopted by different countries across Asia for augmenting their own security. So some are following hedging strategies, like if you look at Southeast Asia. Okay, 2 more minutes. Some are following some other trees, some are part of some alliance systems and so on. Now, the only system that was in place in Asia was the US alliance, security alliance system. And that was a post-Second World War framework which was essentially directed at containing communism and then of course containing China. And even though you could say that it was not directed against India, you still have a system which would effectively check the legitimately increasing needs of countries like India and China to play a bigger and bigger role. And hence the argument that is made by some scholars that you can think in terms of a different security architecture which would accommodate the interests, the growing ambitions and aspirations of the growing powers. And India and China are not the only one. There are other also players which are increasingly now beginning to get their act together. So a system which would effectively incorporate this possibility. And the US system is in any case now in practice. So can India and China potentially find this space where they can talk about their the last point is about the fact that the problems that are bilateral, which are still they are confronted by the boundary, we can easily see has retreated. Doklam notwithstanding, has retreated in terms of its potential impact to derail the relationship. That both sides have effectively managed a disputed boundary, and all their efforts seem to be going in improving their systems of management. You can make a critique that there is no attempt to actually resolving it, but they're managing it pretty well. So leave that aside. The number one problem that is now emerging between the two countries is how the Pakistan relationship is going to be handled by China. That it's a clear China-Pakistan nexus that seems to be directed against Indian interests, and that is something on which there is a complete lack of unanimity, if you will, or complete lack of any kind of convergence between the two countries. Finally, some scholars now are increasingly with more force talking about the water issue. That water, particularly China's plans to divert Brahmaputra, are going to be India's big challenge, because its population is going to increase, it's going to need more water. Can we see this? So, question is whether the set of issues that we see as problems have greater potential to derail the possibilities of cooperation. I think that's where the policymakers' acumen and approach will be significant. Let me quickly stop there and let's